Snow crusted the edges of the ravine like a wound healing badly. The land stretched wide and silent, every sound swallowed by the cold. In that endless whiteness, a man moved slow, deliberate, dragging a length of iron chain that scraped faintly against the frozen earth. His breath steamed and vanished, leaving nothing behind. He looked as if time itself had worn him down to tendon and will. His name was Eli Ward, though few still used it. He was setting traps again, though not for the bounty they'd once brought. The pelts hung stiff in his cabin like trophies from another life, reminders of years when he'd been someone worth naming. Now the traps were habit, something to do with his hands when his heart could not bear the stillness. The wolves had taken his cattle 2 winters back, but it was not the beasts he hunted anymore. It was memory. The wind picked up, whispering across the brittle grass, and Eli paused. A low sound carried with it the distant cry of something alive, but weak. He frowned, pulling his coat tighter. He had no reason to follow that sound. The plains were merciless. Whatever had fallen would soon be gone, its story buried under snow. Still, he went. Some things, he reckoned, a man does without knowing why. He found her near the creek, half buried under drifted snow. A horse lay beside her, neck twisted, one leg caught in a hidden root. She was alive barely. Her hair, the color of chestnut bark, clung to her face, and her hands were blue at the fingertips. Eli crouched, brushed snow from her cheek. She flinched at his touch, but did not wake. "Damn fool," he muttered, not sure if he meant her or himself. He lifted her gently, surprised at how light she was, and carried her back through the rising storm. The walk was long, the cold biting through his gloves, but he moved steady, as if some old rhythm had returned to guide him. When he reached his cabin, he laid her by the fire. The light caught her face, and something in him stirred a shape he did not recognize, or perhaps one he'd buried too deep. He cut away her frozen coat, wrapped her in blankets, and forced a trickle of warm broth past her lips. Outside, the wolves began to howl, distant, mournful, the sound of a world that never stops taking. Through the night he tended her, half out of duty, half out of something nameless. When her eyes finally opened, the color startled him, a pale green, sharp as thawing ice. She stared at the ceiling for a long while before turning to him. "Where?" Her voice cracked. "North Fork," he said. "You fell. Horses gone." She blinked, dazed, and a tear traced down her temple. "I was heading for Red Butte. My brother." Eli poured her a cup of water and handed it over. "Rest first. Talk later." She tried to smile, though it came out thin. "You saved me." "Maybe," he said. "We'll see." When morning came, the storm had passed. The world outside glittered cruelly under the new sun, all beauty and no mercy. She sat by the window, wrapped in one of his shirts, watching the horizon as if expecting it to move. He brewed coffee, the smell filling the small room. "Name?" he asked. "Clara," she said softly. "Clara James." He nodded once. "You plan on dying out here, Clara James?" Her lips curved faintly. "Not if I can help it." For the first time in many years, Eli smiled, not wide, not warm, but real. The days that followed moved slow. Clara regained her strength, her hands trembling as she learned to chop wood, feed the fire, and melt snow for water. Eli watched her quietly, the way he might study weather, uncertain whether it meant storm or spring. She never spoke of her brother again, and he did not ask. They shared silence like two travelers sharing a road neither had chosen. Sometimes he would find her standing outside at dusk, the light bleeding red across the snow. She would stare toward the hills, her breath rising like prayer. "Once," she said, "I used to think the world was kind." Eli had no answer for that. One morning, he returned from checking traps to find her mending his old coat. The cabin smelled of smoke and bread, a smell he hadn't known in years. He stopped in the doorway, unsure what to do with the feeling that rose in him, heavy and strange. "Figured it needed fixing," she said, not looking up. He grunted. "Ain't much left worth fixing." She met his eyes then. "That depends on what you're talking about." Outside, the wolves cried again, but their sound seemed farther now, as though the world itself had stepped back to listen. Morning lengthened and settled into a thin blue hush. He rose before light, stoked the stove, and stepped outside while frost still ringed the pump like a halo. The sky was a pale bruise above the hills. He split wood with measured blows, each strike a dull thud that traveled into his shoulders. When he came back in, she was awake and waiting with his mended coat across her knees, her feet tucked into wool socks too big for her. No talk, only the sound of kettles and the small country of fire. She learned the place the way a person learns a prayer, line by stubborn line. He showed her where the creek ran green even under ice, and where the drifts hid holes that could snap a leg. He handed her a hatchet and said nothing. She studied the grain of the log, set the blade, and missed twice. On the third try, the wood parted with a sound like a breath let go. She gave a short laugh, startled at it. Her cheeks were raw from cold, her hands blistered and then toughened. She moved through the days with the focus of someone who had run out of easy illusions. He watched and marked the way she kept fear close, but not ruling. At night, she turned coins of flour into bread and lined his shelves with jars he had not used in years. She asked quiet questions about the land, what wind meant weather, which stars told a man to hurry home. When she spoke of herself, the words came hard, like stones pried from frozen ground. Her brother's name slipped out once at dusk, Luke. She said it like a promise she was trying not to break. He sat across from her with a whetstone and a blade and worked his anger down to nothing. He had been another man once, a husband in a house with a porch and a pear tree that did not take to this altitude. He had built a cradle that stayed empty, and then a fence that could not hold the world at bay. There was a winter of fever and a spring of burial. After that, he learned how to live without witnesses. He kept those years folded tight, like a map he had no reason to open. One afternoon, clouds built slow and tall over the mesa. They went to haul water before the sky could decide. She shouldered a yoke in 2 tin pails like a farm girl from a gentler county. The yoke dug at her collarbones. She did not complain. At the creek, ice skimmed the edges and sang. She bent to fill the pails and froze at a print in the mud oval, wide, clawed. "Wolf," she said, and the word fell soft and sure. "More than one," he answered, pointing at the ghost of another track. "They travel like a thought." He said it without heat. He had spent years hating the hunger of wolves, as if it were a decision. Now he felt something else. Not mercy exactly, just understanding. Everything with teeth is trying to live. They hauled water back against the first flakes, breath steaming, pails knocking in a rhythm that felt like work done right. Inside, with the door pressed shut and the fire talking low, she stitched the torn hem of her skirt while he marked his traps on the table with a nub of charcoal. Not for bounties, not anymore. He placed them like punctuation in a story the land told, wary and precise. Something had been circling the cabin nights, not bold enough to risk the light. He had seen prints near the woodpile, and one white hair caught on a splinter that did not belong to any wolf. When the storm came full, it took the world and shook it. Snow drifted against the panes and turned the day to a dim room. The roof ticked as if remembering rain. He tested the door and found it heavy with drift. He put his shoulder to it and opened a slice of cold they both could feel in their teeth. They worked together to bank the walls with snow and seal the gaps with rags, their breath meeting and mingling in the lantern light. He noticed the way she steadied the ladder for him, one hand bare to better grip, and he felt a small surge in the chest that was not exactly gratitude and not exactly pain. That night, when the wind eased, a silence fell so complete a person could hear his own thinking. From that quiet rose a sound, soft, not far, like a whimper pressed through cloth. He lifted his head. She had heard it too. They looked at each other and did not speak. He took down the rifle and checked the chamber, more from old habit than need. She pulled his spare coat tight, jaw set. "Stay," he said, but there was no sternness in it. "I can help," she answered, already wrapping a scarf. "If it is hurt." They stepped into air that smelled of iron and pine, lantern swinging. The snow squeaked under their boots. He led, choosing the firmer ground, and she followed close, her breath quick and steady at his shoulder. The sound came again, higher now, a thread pulled tight. He paused at the edge of the woodpile, then moved past it toward the line of cottonwoods that marked the run of water. There, between 2 drifts, something struggled, small but fierce, a knot of pale fur snapping and twisting against an iron jaw. It was not a wolf, it was a dog, frost rimming its whiskers, one ear torn bloody. A farm animal or a trail stray, he could not tell. Its eyes showed whites like a spooked horse's. It lunged when he drew near, teeth clicking shut on air. "Easy," she said just once, and knelt in the snow. Her hands hovered and then settled, slow as thaw, on the animal's neck. He had never seen that kind of steadiness in a newcomer to these parts. He had seen it in old ranch wives who could set a bone and salt a hide before daylight broke. She hummed, a tune with no words and no prettiness, only patience. The dog went stiff, then low. He slid the lever, sprung the trap, and pulled the iron teeth apart. The dog yelped and fell into her lap as if that had always been the ending. She held it a moment longer than necessary, like a woman holding on to proof that gentleness still worked. He felt the old rooms in him crack their doors. They carried it in, set it by the fire, and fed it broth from a chipped cup. Snow melted off its back, darkening the floorboards. The dog's tail tapped once, twice. She smiled in spite of herself, one corner of her mouth lifting. He realized he had been waiting to see that. "Not a wolf," she said at last. "No," he answered, and looked at the line of traps on the table as if they were parts of a language he had misread. The wind went quiet. The night leaned close, listening. Dawn came slow, yellow and uncertain, bleeding through the frost-rimmed glass. The dog stirred by the hearth, one paw twitching as if it still ran in dreams. Clara sat cross-legged beside it, whispering something he couldn't quite catch, maybe a name, maybe a prayer. Eli leaned against the doorframe, coffee cooling in his hand, watching the scene with a silence that felt heavier than words. It had been a long time since another voice had lived in his house, a long time since a living thing had looked at him with trust. The cabin no longer felt hollow. The air moved differently, as if learning again how to hold warmth. Outside, snow was giving way to meltwater, the creek beginning to murmur its thawing song. He stepped out and scanned the hills. Tracks circled near the woodline again. Wolf, this time for certain. The prints came close, then veered off, leaving a message only the land could write. He crouched and touched the mark. The ice beneath his fingers was softening, same as his resolve. He didn't want to kill them anymore, not after last night, but a man had to protect what was his, even if he no longer knew what that meant. When he came back, Clara was feeding the dog strips of jerky. She looked up, her hair undone and lit by firelight, and said, "He'll live." Eli nodded, then set his rifle aside. "You plan to keep it?" She shrugged, smiling faintly. "Seems he chose me." Something in him eased. "Name him, then." She thought for a moment. "Mercy," she said, and he looked at her long, as if the word had struck something buried deep. The days followed with a rhythm that felt near to peace. She mended, baked, hauled water, and sang when she thought he wasn't listening. He set traps farther from the cabin now, less out of vengeance and more to mark boundaries, a quiet treaty with the wilderness. Mercy followed at her heels wherever she went, a small shadow learning loyalty again. Sometimes, in the evenings, they would sit outside on the porch he'd once built for someone else. The sky would burn down into purple and ash, and the stars would blink open one by one like slow forgiveness. Clara would talk, softly, about her brother Luke, the farm near Red Butte, the debt that drove them to ruin, the promise she had made to start again. "I thought if I could make it north," she said one night, "I'd find work, maybe even buy the land back." "You still might," Eli said. She gave him a look, sharp and tired. "You think the world's kind enough for that?" He didn't answer. Instead, he handed her his coat, heavy with the smell of smoke and pine. It was the small gestures that bound them, the shared tasks, the silence between words, the warmth traded in passing. He began to notice her hands first, how they moved with purpose. Then her laugh, quiet but stubborn. Then the way she looked at him, not as a ghost, not as a man to fear, but as someone she was learning to understand. Spring crept in, cautious but certain. The snow receded, revealing earth raw and damp beneath. Wild geese cut lines across the sky, and the hills, once white, began to breathe again. Clara planted a small garden near the cabin, a patch of earth no larger than a blanket. He watched her kneel, fingers deep in soil, and something inside him broke open like a seed in thaw. But peace in that country never held for long. It was a Thursday when riders came, 3 men from Red Butte, rough-looking, their coats dusty and their faces drawn with hunger and debt. They rode straight to the cabin, without greeting. Eli stepped out, hand resting on the rifle propped by the door. One of them, broad-shouldered with eyes like wet stone, nodded toward Clara. "That your woman?" Eli's jaw tightened. "She's got a name." The man spat in the dirt. "She had a brother named Luke James. Owed us plenty before he ran north. Word is, she's come to settle it." Clara stepped forward, pale but steady. "Luke's dead," she said. "You know that." The man grinned, showing a gold tooth. "Debt don't die easy, sweetheart. You can pay it another way." His eyes dragged over her in a way that made Eli's blood rise slow and hot. He took one step forward. "You'll turn around," he said, voice low, "and ride back the way you came." The man laughed. "You think you scare us, old-timer?" Eli didn't answer. He didn't need to. He stood still as the mountains behind him, his silence heavier than threat. The men shifted in their saddles. The wind stirred, whispering through the dry grass. Then Mercy growled a deep, certain sound. The men's horses danced nervously, nostrils flaring. One rider swore, jerking the reins. Eli's voice was quiet but sharp. "Take that as your warning." For a moment, no one moved. Then the leader spat again and wheeled his horse around. "Ain't done yet," he said. "We'll be back." When they were gone, Clara trembled, not from fear, but from fury. "They'll come again," she whispered. Eli nodded. "Then we'll be ready." That night he sat at the table, oiling his rifle, while she packed supplies and checked the locks. Mercy slept at her feet. The cabin felt smaller, the air thick with things unsaid. Outside, the wolves howled again, closer this time, as if drawn by the scent of coming blood. He looked at Clara, her face set like stone against the lamplight. "You don't have to stay," he said. She met his eyes. "And leave you to fight alone?" He almost smiled. "You're not built for easy roads, are you?" "Neither are you," she said. They sat in silence, listening to the wind build against the walls. 2 souls stitched together by hardship and choice, waiting for whatever the night meant to bring. The moon hung low and red that night, a cold coin cast over the plains. The world was still, except for the whisper of the wind through the dry grass, the slow shifting of the dog's paws in sleep. Eli lay awake on the cot, eyes fixed on the ceiling beams, counting the seconds between gusts. The air held a weight he knew well, the kind that comes before a reckoning. He rose before dawn. The sky had turned the color of ash, the horizon streaked with a faint seam of silver. Clara was already up, her hair braided tight, the rifle resting on her knees. She did not speak when he entered, only handed him a cup of coffee she had kept warm on the stove. Their fingers brushed an accident, or maybe not, and in that brief contact, he felt something stronger than fear. "They'll come back today," she said quietly. "Most likely." "You ever kill a man?" He paused before answering. "Once. Didn't make me any better for it." She nodded, not judging, only understanding. "Then maybe we aim not to." Eli looked at her for a long time. "That's a hard promise to keep out here." The sun lifted slow and pale over the ridge, spilling light across the snowmelt. They waited. The hours moved like years. Mercy prowled near the door, hackles half raised. The wind shifted, bringing the faint smell of horses before the sound of them. 3 riders again. Same men, same hunger in their faces. They dismounted just beyond the fence and spread out, boots crunching in the thawed dirt. The leader, the one with the gold tooth, called out, "Told you we'd be back." Eli stepped onto the porch, rifle in hand. "You made a mistake coming here." The man grinned. "We'll see who made the mistake." His hand hovered near his gun belt. Clara stood behind Eli, rifle steady. Her voice was calm, almost gentle. "You don't want to do this." The second man sneered. "Lady, you got no idea what we want." What happened next unfolded with the slow inevitability of a storm. A hand twitched toward a gun, a shout split the air, and then came the crack of a rifle, one shot, clean, echoing off the hills. Dust rose. The man with the gold tooth staggered, clutching his shoulder, eyes wide with disbelief. Eli lowered his weapon. "That's your warning," he said. For a moment, no one moved. Then the wounded man swore, stumbled to his horse, and the others followed, cursing, spitting, pulling him up. They rode off into the scrub, their shapes shrinking against the land until they were nothing more than ghosts in the glare. When silence returned, it came like exhaustion. Clara set her rifle down and sank to her knees. The sound she made wasn't relief, it was something deeper, like the body remembering it's still alive. Eli knelt beside her, his hand hovering over her shoulder before resting there. "They'll tell others," she whispered. "Maybe, but not soon. And not about a woman who could shoot like that." She gave a weak laugh, then bit her lip, trembling. "I didn't mean to." "You meant to survive?" he said softly. "That's different." Outside, the land lay quiet again, the snow nearly gone, the ground soft beneath the thaw. Mercy nosed at her hand, whining low. She stroked the dog absently, eyes fixed on nothing. Later, they buried the spent shell behind the cabin, a small ritual neither could explain. Eli tamped down the earth and stood looking at the line of mountains. The wind had shifted south, warm now, carrying the smell of pine and new grass. For the first time in years, he could almost believe in the idea of spring. That night, they ate in silence, the fire painting their faces gold. Clara reached for the coffee pot and said quietly, "You ever think about leaving this place?" He thought for a long time before answering. "Used to. Then I stopped. Didn't seem right to run from the things that made me." She nodded. "Maybe not running. Maybe just moving towards something else." He looked up then, and her eyes caught the firelight, green and alive. Something passed between them, quiet, certain, and new. In the days that followed, the land softened further. The creek sang again, and the hills turned the faintest green. They worked side by side, repairing the fence, digging deeper rows for the garden, building a small coop for the chickens Clara said she would buy once they reached town. The dog followed wherever they went, limping still, but faithful. Once, while she was kneeling in the dirt, Eli found himself saying, "Didn't figure I'd share this place again." She smiled without looking up. "You didn't. It shared you." That evening they sat on the porch while the sun sank low, spilling its last light across the valley. The air smelled of wet soil and smoke. She leaned her head against his shoulder, tentative at first, then certain. He didn't move, didn't need to. For a long while they stayed that way, listening to the slow music of wind and earth. Somewhere out beyond the ridge, the wolves began to sing again, not hunting now, not threatening, only answering the echo of their own kind. He listened, and for the first time in many years, he felt no urge to set a trap. By midsummer, the valley had changed its skin. The snowmelt had given way to tall grass that swayed like an ocean under the wind. Cottonwoods shimmered along the creek, their leaves whispering in the long afternoons. The air carried the scent of sage and dust, and the sound of insects thrummed like a distant heartbeat. Eli and Clara worked in quiet rhythm. The garden had taken root, a small miracle stitched together with stubbornness and prayer. The dog, Mercy, patrolled the edges of the homestead as though born to guard it. Each day began with the same sound, the creak of the well rope, the splash of cold water, and Clara's voice humming something faint and half forgotten. Eli had not realized how much sound a life could make until she came. For years, the silence had been his armor, the measure of his guilt. Now, when he woke to the rustle of her moving in the next room, it felt less like intrusion and more like proof he was still among the living. One morning, he found her standing by the fence, sleeves rolled, eyes fixed on the horizon. A small bird perched on the post beside her, unafraid. "It's been quiet," she said. He nodded. "Quiet can be good. Or it can be waiting," she murmured. He knew she meant the men from Red Butte. They had not returned, though every dusk Eli still watched the distant road, half expecting to see dust rise. "You're safe here," he said, but even he could hear the uncertainty in his voice. Clara turned to him then, her gaze steady. "No one's safe anywhere, Eli, but we can choose where to stand when the wind comes." He looked at her for a long moment. The light touched her face, and he thought of all the things the world had tried to take from her and failed. "You talk like someone who's lived through fire," he said. "I have," she answered, "but I'm done running from the smoke." That day, they rode to town together for the first time. It was a small place, one street, 2 saloons, a church, and a mercantile where gossip was cheaper than flour. People stared when they rode in. Clara felt their eyes but kept her head high. Eli walked beside her, silent as ever, the kind of man the townsfolk knew better than to question. They traded pelts and bought seed, nails, a new kettle, and fabric that Clara chose without asking his opinion. At the counter, the shopkeeper asked if they'd be registering their name together for the ledgers. Eli hesitated. Clara looked at him, calm, patient, unafraid. He cleared his throat. "Ward," he said finally. "Eli and Clara Ward." The shopkeeper wrote it down without comment, but Clara's hand brushed his as they left the store, light as a falling leaf, and he knew the weight of what he'd just done. On the way home, the wind turned sharp, carrying the metallic scent of coming rain. They reached the cabin just as the first drops began to fall. Inside, thunder rolled like the voice of the mountains. Mercy hid under the table, trembling. Clara knelt beside the dog, whispering soft words that barely rose above the storm. Eli stood by the window, watching the rain-carved rivers through the dirt. He thought of how much this land had taken, and how, somehow, it still gave back. Clara came to stand beside him. "You ever think," she said quietly, "that maybe we don't find places to belong? Maybe they find us?" He turned to her. The lantern light caught the faint scar along her jaw, the mark of some old cruelty. "Maybe," he said, "or maybe it's the people who do." The storm broke fully then, sheets of water hammering the roof. The cabin shuddered, but held. She reached for his hand. For a moment, neither spoke. The world outside roared, and within that sound was a kind of cleansing. When morning came, the earth was washed clean. The sky stretched blue and endless, the kind of blue that made a man believe in second chances. Clara stepped outside, barefoot in the wet grass, her dress clinging to her knees. She tilted her face to the sun and closed her eyes. Eli watched from the doorway, a slow smile spreading across the weathered lines of his face. She looked like a promise the land had decided to keep. By late summer, the first wildflowers bloomed along the creek. The garden thrived. He built her a porch swing from old fence wood, and sometimes they'd sit there until night fell, her head resting against his shoulder, the stars spreading thick and silver across the black. He told her stories then of the war, of the wife he'd buried, of the child that never drew breath. She listened, never turning away, and when he finished, she reached for his hand and said simply, "You're still here." So he was. Against all reason, he was. And when the wind rose again that night, carrying the distant song of wolves across the valley, it no longer sounded like warning. It sounded like belonging. The dogs stirred, the fire cracked, and the mountains stood watch. The cabin glowed with quiet life, the kind a man does not earn, but learns to honor. Eli looked at Clara, and the years between who he'd been and who he'd become felt smaller than the space between heartbeats. He no longer needed to set traps to know what could be caught in this wilderness. Some things, he understood now, were never meant to be hunted. They were meant to be found.